right now, because I'm working on Magento, we can talk about these things, uh, about the Magento architecture. So my understanding was, what I was thinking is caching, queue management, routing, rendering framework, database and ORM, module and extensibility, testing frameworks, security and cryptography. These happen to be architectural decisions which you have to make when you build an enterprise application. There could definitely be more than this, but this is what I'm aware of. Now, I think it's very important to learn these skills because these skills are applicable even when you work on some other application which is probably built in a different language, because these are all concepts. So for example, we would think about caching. Obviously we have talked a lot about cache management and stuff like that, but then now queue management. So queue management, uh, you would think about what how do you want to manage queue, how to manage, okay, uh, how do you want your queue consumers to be implemented, queue consumers, right? Then comes routing. So how do you want routing to be, what is the pattern, where would you store your routes, what would be your routing conventions, what would consist your dynamic routes, so how would your redirects work, that is something, how would you pass parameters to your routing, what would be different areas of your application, so that would come under routing. So you would also have to make these decisions when you build an application. Then rendering framework, which is like obvious, what kind of rendering mechanism do you want. There will be different uh, kinds of outputs you would need. HTML is just one. You could also support JSON, which is commonly supported. Then how do you want your framework to work for HTMLs? You would need, how would your layouts be stored and other things. So along with that, I think, so your rendering framework becomes one decision that you have to make. How would you add new JavaScripts, CSS and other static assets? How would you include images? So that becomes a part of rendering framework. Then of course, database and ORM. Are you going to use MySQL, MongoDB? What kind of ORM system are you going to use? Let's say if you create a database, if you have database like Magento, which is in MySQL, then what is the way your application, how will your application add new tables to the database? How will it upgrade database and the columns of the database? Then next would be, how would your application access ORM? Would there be a consistent way to access the database queries, a database? How would it process joins? So that becomes part of the database ORM system. Now I think this particular one, module and extensibility, this is a very core decision, in my mind. When you start an application, when you start implementing an application and you start making architectural decisions, I think this becomes very important decision you have to make. How will you support modularity and extensibility frameworks? How will you register new modules? How will you override a particular functionality? So for example, dependency injection and dependency container, both both may come under module and extensibility framework. So I think, how will solid principles fit into your whole application? I think this is the layer where you make this decision. Again, testing framework also happens to be a very core decision, and I think These would be the first of many other decisions you would make. I think the first, when you start building your application or when you start architecting your application, I think you will start thinking about module and extensibility framework and testing framework. Because if you're following any TDD approach or any kind of test driven development, this is going to be crucial. So making decisions on which testing frameworks to use, what would be the file structure, what would be the application structure, I think these decisions go hand in hand. And then finally, of course, security and cryptography. So under security and cryptography, you would have authentication, authorization, and then of course you have other encryption related, you may have other encryption and security features of your application. For example, how will you prevent your application, how does your application filter input data from the website, from the user? Then that becomes one. Another could be how are you rendering output. So your rendering framework may use your security and cryptography and escaping features. So that becomes a very important thing to talk about. So I think one of the architectural characteristics, which is scalability, has to be discussed. But I think you also need to answer, what do you mean by scalability? I mean, scalable with respect to what? Your application to scale, your application should scale with data or just with load? What do you mean by scalability? Also is, I think, a very important question to ask. So having said that, um, so I think these are the application implementation details or architectural level details, decisions you have to make when you build a new application. And on top of these features, on top of these decisions and the framework that you build with this, you start building your actual domain. So not what would you call it, domain specific implementation. For example, Magento's domain is e-commerce, so uh, all the features like catalog and customer order, sales, those functionality modules or payment gateways, they just reuse the broader system, which is this. Caching, queue management, routing, rendering, database, and ORM. I think this is where you will build your each characteristic, I think, has to be discussed on every level, every architectural characteristic. For example, scale. uh, does your caching, does your cache storage scale, is a question you may ask. Another is security. Are you connecting to your caching database securely, or is it prone to cache poisoning? Then what other? So we have talked about scale, security, then performance, right? So you would have what kind of performance gains do you get from caching? What is cached, what is not cached? How cache is purged also determines performance. Then next would be observability. You need to track your cache hit miss ratio. Even for queue management, if a task fails, that needs to be logged. So observability is something we have talked about. Security, we have already talked about. Performance, Okay, what architectural characteristic am I missing? Mm, and of course, documentation. Documentation is not an architectural characteristic, but maybe it is. So I'm just gonna write it down. Documentation. Okay, that also has to happen on all levels. What other things? Scale, security, performance, observability, documentation, deployability. I think, yeah, deployability. That also be has to thought on all layers. Compliance, legal compliance, of course, but we would just consider that under, say, security. What else? Extensibility, of course. Caching. Are you able to extend caching? So, extensibility. Then, other one is testability. So that also becomes an important aspect of, are you able to test your caching systems, or are you able to integration test your code? So that becomes one thing. What else? So for now, this is what. So the main purpose of writing is all down is, when I study application, when I study Magento application, what is it that I should be studying? So that's what I was trying to decide, and this seems like an answer. I would always want to start with core, how core is implemented, because rest of the features just use the core. So this is the pathway that I want to take.